Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are exploring the ultimate battleground, the human mind and soul. We're looking at a fascinating stack of sources that tackle the biggest concepts of our existence: the nature of God, the perspective of atheism and science, and the very roots of evil. From John Milton's epic literary clash between Jesus and the devil in the wilderness to modern neuroscience mapping the brains of psychopathic killers, we are asking the ultimate questions. Are we inherently wicked? Are we guided by invisible divine forces, or are we just biologically wired?
It's a completely staggering scope when you step back and look at it. Bridging 17th century theological poetry and, ancient world history with cold, hard, clinical brain scans.
Right.
It forces us to look at human behavior through these completely contradictory lenses.
Yeah, it really does. But before we get completely lost in the wilderness of the human mind here, let me just say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. Now, a quick note on our mission for this deep dive.
Oh, right, the disclaimer.
Exactly. We are unpacking two incredibly rich sources today. One is this in-depth analysis of John Milton's poem Paradise Regained from the Wendigoon Channel, and the other is a documentary exploration of evil featuring Morgan Freeman.
Two very different vibes.
For sure. And because these sources dive headfirst into highly charged political and religious topics, specifically the existence of God, atheism, and where morality actually comes from, we are strictly remaining impartial.
Right, absolutely.
We are not taking sides. We're not endorsing any religious or secular viewpoints. We are just neutrally reporting on these fascinating ideas to help you, the listener, understand how humanity frames the concepts of divine good and absolute evil.
And, to truly understand how these sources define absolute evil, we first have to understand how they frame ultimate good.
Right. Where does the baseline start?
Exactly. We start with the theological baseline presented in Paradise Regained. The setup is iconic. It's Jesus, fresh from his baptism, wandering into the wilderness and fasting for 40 days.
That specific setting sparks this massive theological debate that was just raging during Milton's time regarding the true nature of Jesus.
Oh, yeah. Because if Jesus was entirely omniscient and omnipotent, any temptation presented by the devil would be mathematically meaningless.
Right. A being of pure, untouchable power cannot be genuinely tempted because there's just zero risk of failure.
Yeah, it's an empty exercise.
It's almost like playing a video game on God mode. Like,
Yeah.
if you can't take damage, winning doesn't actually mean anything. For the story to have any stakes at all, Jesus had to take off the divine armor to truly face the devil.
He had to be capable of breaking.
Exactly.
And Milton's portrayal directly addresses that problem. He aligns with the consensus that Jesus was fully God and fully man. So yes, he possessed divine wisdom, but out there in that wilderness, he was experiencing a grueling mortal reality.
We starving.
Right. He felt agonizing human hunger, profound sadness, and, genuine temptation. Sinless perfection without the vulnerability of human temptation is just an empty concept.
So Satan knows this.
Oh, absolutely. Satan's entire strategy in the poem is to test if this fragile human form can be cracked by the same pride that felled Adam and Eve. Satan recognizes the vulnerability.
But he doesn't come at him like a monster.
No, not at all. He approaches Jesus through deception. He disguises himself as just this innocent old man in the woods, casually suggesting a starving Jesus use his power to turn rocks into bread.
Just a helpful suggestion.
Right. And later, he appears as a wealthy ruler offering vast kingdoms, armies, and earthly fame. It is the classic archetype of external evil, like this outside invisible force actively trying to deceive, hijack your desires, and corrupt you.
Okay, but Milton's version of a literal whispering demon assumes that we have a perfectly functioning moral compass that is being externally hijacked.
Yes, that the hardware is intact.
Right. So what happens when the compass itself is physically broken? That's where modern neuroscience completely flips this script. When we look at the Morgan Freeman documentary, we shift abruptly from theology to secular biology.
It is a jarring shift. We meet Dr. Kiehl, who is a neuroscientist, and he has scanned the brains of 800 psychopathic criminals.
800? That's a massive sample size.
It's huge. And he walks us through the specific case of an extreme psychopath serving a life sentence for horrific crimes, including rape and murder.
And the fMRI scan of this inmate's brain reveals something chillingly clear about the physical mechanics of morality, right? Dr. Kiehl points straight to the orbital frontal cortex.
Yeah. And let's break down how that part of the brain actually functions.
Well, the orbital frontal cortex acts essentially as the brain's braking system. So when your amygdala generates a primal, selfish, or violent impulse, the orbital frontal cortex is the structure that processes empathy, assesses future consequences, and pumps the brakes.
It stops you from acting on the dark thought.
Exactly. But in this particular killer, that braking system is severely underdeveloped. He sits in the 99th percentile of abnormality. Yeah. His brain physically lacks the dense neural pathways required to generate empathy or remorse. The man himself sits in the interview and casually states that he simply isn't wired like everyone else.
He feels nothing.
Right. He feels nothing when he harms others because the biological hardware required to feel something is just missing.
And here's where the atheistic and scientific challenge really takes hold. If evil is just a matter of low cellular density in the orbital frontal cortex, doesn't that render the whole concept of a supernatural devil or spiritual sin completely obsolete?
That is the million-dollar question. From a purely scientific perspective, the devil isn't a fallen angel tempting us in the wilderness. The devil is just bad neural wiring.
We're just meat machines.
And sometimes the machine has a factory defect.
The tension there is profound, though, because if morality is governed entirely by gray matter and those physical structures are broken, the resulting behavior is what society labels as evil. But neuroscience strips away the moral judgment.
Right. It's medicalized.
Exactly. Dr. Kiehl is hoping to use these fMRI scans to predict and prevent violent behavior in youth. He's currently scanning 14 to 16-year-olds in prison for homicide. His approach fundamentally turns evil into a treatable biological disease rather than a spiritual failing.
Wait, but think about that. If this killer is biologically unwired for empathy, does that mean evil is just a medical condition? Like if a teenager commits murder because their orbital frontal cortex didn't develop, that completely upends how we view moral accountability.
It totally rewrites the justice system in theory.
But it also raises a massive historical question. If science points to an internal biological origin for bad behavior, where did humanity get the idea of an external cosmic devil in the first place? Why does almost every ancient culture invent a monster in the dark to explain human cruelty?
Well, the documentary traces that exact evolution, which is fascinating. It takes us back 3,500 years to ancient Iran to a faith called Zoroastrianism.
Which predates Judaism and Christianity.
Way before. Zoroaster originally postulated a cataclysmic battle between two mentalities, one good and one bad.
Just mentalities, not beings.
Right. But history shows us that the Israelites assimilated this idea while they were exiled in Babylon, and that cultural blending took the abstract concept of a bad mentality and externalized it, leading directly to the creation of the devil, or Satan, as a singular entity in the Abrahamic faiths.
But not every ancient culture externalized evil as a demon you had to fight. Look at the ancient Egyptian concept of the weighing of the heart.
Oh, right, against the feather of truth.
Yeah. When you died, your heart was placed on a scale. If you lived a deceitful, cruel life, your heart literally became heavy. An evil, heavy heart stopped you from entering the afterlife.
So the evil wasn't a monster.
No, it was the physical accumulation of your own choices. The evil was inside you.
And we see another brilliant contrast in the Hindu practices in Varanasi, India. There, evil isn't an all-powerful cosmic opponent that must be vanquished with fire and brimstone.
Right, it's totally different.
Yeah. Often in the terrible things that happen, bad luck, illness, malice, are attributed to the unhappy spirit of an ancestor. The community doesn't combat this evil by declaring war on it.
They don't fight it.
No, they try to cure it through a benign goblin, offering the troubled spirit food, shoes, and umbrellas to help it find peace. They domesticate the evil.
That is so interesting. So what does this all mean? The concept of the devil basically evolved to fit the psychological needs of the culture.
Completely.
He started as an abstract mentality in Zoroastrianism, became the literal conversational tempter we see in Milton's poem, and evolved into a measurable brain deficit in modern science. Even modern Zoroastrians no longer believe in a literal demon.
Right, the documentary notes they believe the battle is entirely in the mind. Now, good thoughts, good words, good deeds.
Our definition of God and the devil shifts based entirely on whether a culture needs evil to be a treatable disease, an unhappy ghost to be appeased, or a personal choice to be punished.
Which brings us to the psychological crux of the atheist versus faith debate. If evil is internal, whether it's a biological urge or a selfish thought, what actually stops us from acting on it?
Is a belief in God required for human morality, or is religion just a highly effective psychological tool engineered by early societies to keep people in line?
Psychologist Jesse Baring's Princess Alice experiment captures this perfectly.
Oh, this study is wild.
It is. Baring puts children in a room, tells them to throw darts at a board, and strictly tells them not to cross a line on the floor.
And when he leaves them alone, the kids cheat.
Of course they do. They cross the line to get a better shot because they want the prize. Their internal cost-benefit analysis tells them the reward outweighs the non-existent risk of getting caught.
But then Baring completely alters their environment without changing any physical rules. Before leaving the room with the new group of children, he tells them that an invisible, magical being named Princess Alice is sitting in a nearby chair, and she's watching them.
And the kids immediately stop cheating. One little girl even reaches out to feel the empty chair to check if Princess Alice is really there.
It's crazy. The mechanism of the invisible watcher actively rewrites their real-time impulse control. God, or a magical princess, functions like a societal security camera. Even if the camera is unplugged, the mere suggestion of the lens alters human behavior.
Because the mere presence of an observer changes the internal math of the child. Reverend Kiehl, who is featured in the documentary, connects this psychological phenomenon to the Christian concept of original sin.
The idea that humans have an inherent baseline bend towards selfishness and violence.
Right. We want the prize, and we will cross the line to get it.
See, that leans heavily into the secular perspective. If we only act good because we think a magical princess is watching and will punish us with hell, what does that say about human nature? It suggests morality doesn't actually exist in a vacuum. It's just fear of consequences dressed up as virtue.
Well, Reverend Kiehl would argue that this inherent selfishness is exactly why theological frameworks are necessary. And this brings us right back to Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness.
How so?
Satan's entire strategy was appealing to that inherent selfishness. He offered fame, wealth, and absolute power, attempting to override Jesus' devotion to God with the innate biological selfishness of his human form.
Ah, I see.
So belief, whether you view it as a literal divine truth or a psychological construct, acts as the ultimate counterweight to our primal impulses.
Okay, so whether we view evil as a biological glitch in the orbital frontal cortex, a lack of belief in an invisible watcher, or a literal supernatural force whispering in the desert, the ultimate question remains, can it be defeated?
Let's look at the resolutions in our sources. In Paradise Regained, we reach the climax of the psychological warfare. Satan places Jesus on the very pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem and tells him to jump.
He demands that Jesus prove his divinity by having angels catch him, turning faith into a parlor trick.
Exactly, and Jesus defeats him not with a flashy miracle or a lightning bolt, but by simply quoting scripture, "Tempt not the Lord thy God."
He refuses to engage in the toxic pride that ruins Satan.
Right. And because of that steadfast endurance, the refusal to let his ego override his principles, Satan falls, defeated, tumbling from the sky like a mythical griffin.
But on the human level, the documentary shows us a very different, deeply visceral path to defeating evil through the story of Brian Widner, the former neo-Nazi.
That segment was heavy.
Very. For 16 years, Brian was an enforcer for a hate group, just full of violence and destruction. He admits his behavior was borderline sociopathic, entirely disconnected from empathy.
But the turning point for Widner was the birth of his son and a newfound belief in a godly presence.
Right. But recognizing his evil wasn't enough. He had to physically purge it. He endured 25 agonizing laser surgeries over 2.5 years to remove the violent racist tattoos covering his face.
He viewed the extreme, blinding physical pain of the lasers as a necessary penance to wipe away his past.
What links Jesus starving in the wilderness and the neo-Nazi reforming is endurance. Overcoming evil, whether it's an external temptation or an internal history of violence, requires immense conscious suffering.
It requires a daily, painful choice. It isn't resolved with a magic wand or a sudden epiphany.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. We've gone from the theological summits of Jesus and Satan's debate in 17th century poetry to the neural pathways of 21st century psychopaths.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We've analyzed how a belief in God, the psychological absence of God, and the literal wiring of our brains shape our entire understanding of right and wrong.
And, the debate between faith and science regarding morality will likely never be settled. But the mechanisms we use to define our actions, whether we call it sin, a heavy heart, or an underdeveloped frontal cortex, they all serve the same purpose.
Trying to make sense of our capacity to harm one another. So whether you consider yourself deeply religious, a staunch atheist, or somewhere in between, this battle between your selfish impulses and the greater good is playing out in your brain every single day. You are constantly stepping up to the scale, weighing your own heart.
Morgan Freeman offers a final, incredibly provocative thought on this dynamic. He notes that without the presence of evil, we would never develop unique, profound human traits like mercy, resilience, and forgiveness.
Right. You cannot forgive if there is nothing to be forgiven for.
Exactly.
If evil is merely a biological defect, a glitch in the hardware, and science eventually cures it through the brain treatments Dr. Kiehl is researching, do we also cure humanity of its capacity for redemptive goodness? If we no longer have to fight the devil, whether he's a fallen angel in the desert or just bad neurowiring in our heads, do we lose the very struggle that makes us human? The ultimate battleground isn't just about defeating evil. It's about what the fight itself turns us into.